Rome fell in 476 AD. Every schoolchild learns the date. What most of them are never told is that Rome did not actually stop. Half of it kept going. For another 1100 years, an emperor sat on a Roman throne, Roman law was still written down and argued over, and Roman soldiers still marched under a Roman standard. They simply did it from a city on the edge of two continents, in Greek instead of Latin, under a sky full of gold mosaic instead of marble gods. We call this empire Byzantine. Its own people never did. They called themselves Romans, right up until the last morning of May 1453, when a 19-year-old sultan rode a horse through a breach in their wall, and the word finally stopped meaning anything at all in that city. This is the story of the empire in between, the one that outlasted the fall of Rome by 1,000 years and then vanished so completely from popular memory that most people today can tell you more about the Roman legions of Julius Caesar than about the Roman emperor who was still ruling from Constantinople when the printing press was invented. We are going to walk through all of it, slowly, from a tent-sized principality on the edge of a fractured empire to the greatest dome ever raised over an open floor, through plague and siege and civil war and religious argument and slow shrinking territory, to a final dawn that ended something that had, by any reasonable measure, already refused to end for 1,000 years longer than anyone expected it to. There is one question worth carrying through all of it. How does something survive for that long, and why does the world forget it anyway? Part of the answer is simply arithmetic. The Western Roman Empire that most people picture when they hear the word Rome, the one with Julius Caesar and the Colosseum and the legions marching into Gaul, lasted from the founding of the Republic to the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 years, depending on which starting point a historian prefers. The empire this narration follows, the one that kept calling itself Rome from a capital on the Bosphorus, lasted almost exactly as long again on its own after the West had already gone. Two Romes, in effect, stacked one after the other, and popular memory retained the first one in vivid, granular detail, the names, the wars, the emperors, the everyday texture of the thing, while allowing the second, longer one to blur into a vague, largely undifferentiated haze somewhere between the Dark Ages and the Crusades. That asymmetry is not a reflection of which empire mattered more. It is closer to an accident of how Western European historical memory formed centuries later, in societies that increasingly saw themselves as heirs to ancient Rome's western half, and had every cultural incentive to treat the eastern half's continued survival as a footnote rather than the main event it actually was for the people living through it. Rome fell in 476 AD. Every schoolchild learns the date. What most of them are never told is that Rome did not actually stop. Half of it kept going. For another 1100 years, an emperor sat on a Roman throne. Roman law was still written down and argued over, and Roman soldiers still marched under a Roman standard. They simply did it from a city on the edge of two continents, in Greek instead of Latin, under a sky full of gold mosaic instead of marble gods. We call this empire Byzantine. Its own people never did. They called themselves Romans, right up until the last morning of May 1453, when a 19-year-old sultan rode a horse through a breach in their wall, and the word finally stopped meaning anything at all in that city. This is the story of the empire in between, the one that outlasted the fall of Rome by 1,000 years and then vanished so completely from popular memory that most people today can tell you more about the Roman legions of Julius Caesar than about the Roman emperor who was still ruling from Constantinople when the printing press was invented. We are going to walk through all of it, slowly, From a tent-sized principality on the edge of a fractured empire to the greatest dome ever raised over an open floor, through plague and siege and civil war and religious argument and slow shrinking territory to a final dawn that ended something that had, by any reasonable measure, already refused to end for 1,000 years longer than anyone expected it to. There is one question worth carrying through all of it. How does something survive for that long, and why does the world forget it anyway? Part of the answer is simply arithmetic. The Western Roman Empire that most people picture when they hear the word Rome, the one with Julius Caesar and the Colosseum and the legions marching into Gaul, lasted from the founding of the Republic to the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 years, depending on which starting point a historian prefers. The empire this narration follows, the one that kept calling itself Rome from a capital on the Bosphorus, lasted almost exactly as long again, on its own, after the West had already gone. Two Romes, in effect, stacked one after the other, and popular memory retained the first one in vivid, granular detail, the names, the wars, the emperors, the everyday texture of the thing, while allowing the second, longer one to blur into a vague, largely undifferentiated haze somewhere between the Dark Ages and the Crusades. That asymmetry is not a reflection of which empire mattered more. It is closer to an accident of how Western European historical memory formed centuries later in societies that increasingly saw themselves as heirs to ancient Rome's western half and had every cultural incentive to treat the eastern half's continued survival as a footnote rather than the main event it actually was for the people living through it. In the year 324, the Roman Emperor Constantine stood on a low hill above the Bosphorus at the edge of a modest Greek trading town called Byzantium and decided this was where he would build his new capital. Rome, by this point, was a problem the size of an empire. It sat too far west to manage the wealthier, more populous eastern provinces efficiently. Its politics were saturated with the memory of a Senate that no longer meaningfully governed anything, and it had been sacked, threatened, and thought over so many times that its symbolic weight had started to outpace its practical use. Constantine needed a capital that could actually run an empire stretching from Britain to the Euphrates. He needed water on three sides, a narrow strait that any enemy fleet would have to fight to cross, and access to both the Aegean trade routes and the overland roads into Anatolia and the Balkans. Byzantium had all three. He renamed it after himself. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, was dedicated in 330 AD. Built in a hurry with imported columns and statues stripped from older cities across the empire, its walls hastily extended, its forums laid out in a scale that assumed the city would eventually need to be much larger than it currently was. It was, from the very beginning, an act of confidence that outran the facts on the ground. The site itself did most of the strategic work. Constantinople sat on a roughly triangular peninsula, water on two of its three sides, the Golden Horn, a deep natural harbor to the north that could be sealed off entirely with a heavy iron chain stretched across its mouth, and the Sea of Marmara to the south, with only the western landward edge requiring serious fortification. Constantine understood, correctly, that a city built on this shape needed to solve exactly one defensive problem, rather than four, and every wall built across the following century, right through the massive Theodosian fortifications added under his successors in the 5th century, concentrated the empire's engineering effort on that single western approach, rather than spreading it thin around an open perimeter. To make the new capital function as something more than an administrative fiction, Constantine borrowed directly from Rome's own oldest trick for keeping a large city content, the annona, a free grain dole distributed to registered citizens, funded in Constantinople's case primarily from shipments from Egypt, the empire's most reliably productive agricultural province. Bread, in other words, was not simply available in Constantinople. For a significant portion of its population, for nearly 300 years, it was free, delivered daily from public distribution points scattered through the city's 14 administrative regions, an arrangement that bound the political stability of the capital directly to the uninterrupted flow of Egyptian grain ships across the eastern Mediterranean, in a way few residents likely thought about consciously until the day 3 centuries later that the ships stopped coming. For roughly a century and a half, this eastern capital functioned as one half of a still unified Roman world, sharing emperors and armies and a common legal identity with the western half based first in Rome, and then, as things worsened, in Ravenna. The two halves diverged slowly, then quickly. The Western Roman economy contracted under pressure from Gothic, Vandal, and Hunnic incursions that its shrinking tax base and increasingly fragile army could not absorb. The eastern half faced its own pressure from the Persian Sassanid Empire on its eastern frontier, and from various Germanic and Hunnic groups along the Danube. But it had something the West increasingly lacked: a tax system that still functioned, a population dense enough to support it, and a capital that had never, once in its short history, actually fallen to a besieging army. In 476, a Germanic officer named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, and didn't bother replacing him. He sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople as a kind of formal acknowledgement that the western half of the empire no longer needed its own emperor, because there was, in Odoacer's own understanding of the arrangement, only one Roman emperor left. He had been there the whole time. Nobody in the eastern capital experienced 476 as an ending. They experienced it as an administrative simplification. This is the detail that gets lost in the shorthand version of history, the one where Rome fell, and then, 1,000 years later, the Renaissance happened, with a dark and empty middle. The middle was not empty. It was occupied, continuously, by an empire that considered itself the unbroken continuation of the state Augustus had founded 5 centuries earlier. And for a good stretch of its early life, this claim was not merely rhetorical. It was, in real and measurable terms, mostly true. The clearest proof of that came in the reign of Justinian I, who took the throne in 527 with an idea that most of his advisors privately considered reckless. He intended to retake the western provinces the empire had lost. Justinian himself was an unusual figure for a Byzantine emperor, not born into the purple, but risen through the patronage of his uncle, a former soldier who had become emperor before him, and educated well enough to take a genuine working interest in law, theology, and architecture, rather than simply delegating those fields to specialists. He was, by most contemporary accounts, personally austere, working late into the night on administrative business, uninterested in the theatrical excess that later emperors would indulge in. His wife Theodora had an entirely different origin story, the daughter of a bear keeper at the Hippodrome, a former actress, and possibly worse in the eyes of Constantinople's aristocracy, a background that made their marriage a genuine scandal, and that Justinian had to change Roman law to make legally possible at all. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment. The emperor who would codify Roman law for the next 1,000 years had to first amend it so he could marry the woman he wanted. Theodora turned out to be considerably more than a scandal. In 532, 5 years into Justinian's reign, 2 rival chariot racing factions in Constantinople, the Blues and the Greens, whose rivalry doubled as a loose proxy for competing political and religious factions in the city, united in a riot against unpopular tax officials and within days against Justinian himself. The riot became known as the Nika Revolt, named for the crowd's chant of Nika, meaning conquer. Within a week, large sections of the city center were burning, including the original church of Hagia Sophia, and the crowd had installed a rival claimant to the throne. Justinian's advisors urged him to flee by sea while he still could. According to the historian Procopius, who was present in the palace during the crisis, it was Theodora who argued against flight, reportedly telling the assembled council that the imperial purple made a fine burial shroud, that she would rather die as empress than live in exile. Justinian stayed. His general Belisarius led an armed force into the packed hippodrome where the rival claimant had just been crowned and killed an estimated 30,000 people in the enclosed space before the revolt collapsed. It is one of the ugliest single episodes in Byzantine history, and it is also the moment that secured Justinian's throne for the following 30 years of ambition that followed. The Hagia Sophia was the most famous single result of Justinian's building program, but it was far from the only one, and the scale of construction he sponsored across the empire as a whole says as much about his priorities as the one great dome does on its own. Procopius, in a separate treatise devoted entirely to cataloging Justinian's buildings, describes a program that stretched from fortified frontier outposts in North Africa and the Balkans to churches, hospitals, monasteries, cisterns, and aqueducts scattered throughout virtually every province the empire still controlled. A systematic reinforcement of the empire's defensive and civic infrastructure, carried out in tandem with, not instead of, the reconquest campaigns unfolding in Italy and Africa at the same time. In Constantinople itself, Justinian rebuilt the city's underground water storage system on a scale suited to a capital that could no longer assume an uninterrupted peacetime water supply during a prolonged siege, including the vast covered cistern, later known as the Basilica Cistern, its roof supported by more than 300 reused columns scavenged from older buildings, a space built for pure logistical necessity that would many centuries later become one of the most atmospheric surviving interiors from the ancient world for entirely different reasons than the ones that inspired its construction. Out of the ashes of the burned Hagia Sophia, Justinian commissioned something that had no real precedent. He gave the project to two mathematicians rather than conventional architects, Anthium of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, and asked them to solve an engineering problem nobody had solved at that scale before. How to place a circular dome over a square floor plan, and how to make that dome appear to float weightless above an open interior larger than any enclosed space in the Christian world. They used pendantines, curved triangular sections that transitioned the load from a circular dome down into square corners, and they ringed the base of the dome with 40 windows so that the supporting structure would seem to dissolve into light rather than stone. It took 5 years and an enormous portion of the empire's treasury. When it was finished in 537, Justinian is said to have walked into the completed interior, looked up at the dome, and said, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee," a reference to the biblical temple in Jerusalem, and a fairly accurate assessment of what he had actually built. The dome would not be matched in scale anywhere in Europe for nearly 1,000 years. While the dome was rising, Justinian's armies were moving. He sent Belisarius, the same general who had crushed the Nika revolt, to reconquer North Africa from the Vandal kingdom that had held it for roughly a century, since an earlier wave of Germanic migration had carved it away from Roman control in the 5th century. Justinian's own advisors had argued against the campaign, pointing to an earlier 5th century Roman expedition against the same Vandal kingdom that had ended in complete disaster. And the fleet that finally departed Constantinople in the summer of 533 carried an army modest by the standards of Justinian's later ambitions, something under 20,000 men, a gamble on a kingdom whose military reputation, after decades of Vandal raiding across the western Mediterranean, still worried Byzantine planners considerably more than the eventual campaign would eventually justify.
Belisarius landed on the North African coast, marched on the Vandal capital of Carthage, and won 2 decisive battles in quick succession against a Vandal king, Gelimer, whose own forces were unexpectedly caught off guard and divided by an internal succession dispute of their own. Carthage fell within weeks of the landing, and Gelimer himself was captured within the year, brought back to Constantinople to be paraded through the city in a formal triumph, the first such ceremony granted to a private general rather than an emperor personally in centuries, before Justinian, in a gesture combining calculated magnanimity with practical Byzantine administrative habit, granted his defeated rival a country estate in Anatolia rather than the execution a defeated barbarian king might more traditionally have expected. The campaign succeeded faster than almost anyone expected. Belisarius landed in 533 and had effectively ended Vandal rule within a year. Encouraged, Justinian turned him toward Italy and the Ostrogothic kingdom that occupied it. This campaign took far longer, nearly 2 decades of grinding, destructive warfare that devastated the Italian countryside and the city of Rome itself more thoroughly than any of the earlier barbarian sacks had. By the time Byzantine forces under a different general, the eunuch commander Narses, finally secured Italy in 554, the peninsula had been so thoroughly ruined by the fighting that it would take centuries to recover economically, and within another 2 decades, a new group, the Lombards, would take much of it away from Byzantine control regardless.
The reconquest, in other words, was a genuine and remarkable military accomplishment, and it was also, in the longer arithmetic of the empire's resources, close to a mistake. Justinian had extended Byzantine authority around almost the entire rim of the Mediterranean: Italy, North Africa, part of southern Spain, the traditional eastern territories, and had spent an enormous fraction of the empire's wealth and manpower doing it, right as a new and much stranger threat was arriving by ship from Egypt. In 541, a plague reached the port of Pelusium, likely carried on grain ships from Egypt, and from there to Constantinople itself within a year. Modern genetic analysis has confirmed what contemporary accounts described in horrified detail. This was an early strain of the same bacterium, Yersinia pestis, that would return as the Black Death 8 centuries later. Procopius, writing as it unfolded in the capital, described death tolls that modern historians treat with some skepticism as literal numbers, but take entirely seriously as an indication of genuine demographic catastrophe. A plague severe enough that the city ran out of ground to bury the dead and began stacking bodies in the towers of the seawalls instead. Officials tasked with managing burials reportedly resorted, when even the towers filled, to loading corpses onto barges and rowing them out across the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, simply to put them somewhere the living did not have to walk past. Public life in the capital, according to Procopius, effectively stopped for a period of months. Courts closed, workshops shuttered, and the free grain distribution that normally structured the daily routine of a large portion of the population continued only irregularly, administered by whichever officials had not yet fallen ill themselves. Justinian himself contracted the disease and survived, one of the fortunate minority. The empire's population, by conservative modern estimates, may have fallen by something between a fifth and a third across the following decades of recurring outbreaks, a demographic wound that undercut the tax base and manpower the reconquered territories were supposed to draw on. Justinian died in 565 at 78, having ruled for 38 years. He left behind the Hagia Sophia, a legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, that would remain the foundation of civil law across much of Europe for the next 14 centuries, and a Mediterranean world nominally reunited under Roman rule for the last time in its history. He also left behind an exhausted treasury, a population diminished by plague, and reconquered territories in Italy and Spain that Byzantine authority would not be able to hold for very much longer.
Within 3 years of his death, the Lombards had taken most of Italy. Within a century, nearly everything else Belisarius had won would be gone as well. 2 other projects from this same reign deserve more attention than they usually get because they outlasted the territorial gains by a much wider margin than the Dome did. The first was legal. Justinian assigned a jurist named Tribonian to lead a commission tasked with collecting, organizing, and reconciling roughly 9 centuries of accumulated Roman law, imperial edicts, juristic commentary, case precedent, into a single coherent code. The resulting Corpus Juris Civilis, completed in stages through the 530s, did something no earlier Roman government had managed. It took a legal tradition that had grown, contradicted itself, and sprawled across 900 years of imperial rule and organized it into a usable, internally consistent reference. Byzantine judges used it directly for the remainder of the empire's existence. Medieval Italian universities rediscovered it in the 11th century and built the entire academic discipline of civil law around it. Napoleon's own legal code, drafted 12 centuries after Tribonian's commission finished its work, still traces a direct intellectual line back to it. Very little that Justinian's armies conquered in Italy and North Africa remained Byzantine for more than 1 generation or 2. The legal code his lawyers wrote shaped continental European law for the next 1,400 years. The second was civic, and it says something about how Constantinople actually worked as a city rather than as an abstraction. At the heart of the capital sat the Hippodrome, a chariot racing stadium built on a scale that could hold perhaps 100,000 spectators, and racing in Constantinople was never simply entertainment layered on top of politics. It was one of the few structured venues where the city's population could gather in enough numbers to make its feelings known to an emperor who otherwise ruled without anything resembling a vote. The city's racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, functioned as something between sports clubs and organized political constituencies, each with its own preferred emperors, its own networks of patronage, and its own capacity to turn a chariot race into a riot with very little warning, which is precisely what happened in 532 when blue and green partisans who normally hated each other found a shared grievance serious enough to unite against Justinian himself. An emperor who wanted to be seen as legitimate had to be seen regularly at the Hippodrome, seated in the Kathisma box, directly connected to the palace by a private staircase, watching races that were also functionally a running referendum on whether the crowd still tolerated him. What Justinian's reign actually demonstrates, in retrospect, is something that will recur across the whole span of Byzantine history. An empire capable of extraordinary, concentrated achievement, architectural, legal, military, operating permanently at the edge of what its resources could actually sustain. The dome of the Hagia Sophia has stood for nearly 15 centuries. The Corpus Juris Civilis shaped European law for almost as long. The reconquered Western provinces, by comparison, lasted, in most cases, less than 1. The 2.5 centuries after Justinian's death are, by a wide margin, the least remembered stretch of Byzantine history, and also the stretch in which the empire's actual survival was least guaranteed. There is a reason later Byzantines, looking back, treated Justinian's reign as a kind of golden peak they were still trying to recover from the aftermath of. What followed was not decline in any smooth or simple sense. It was a sequence of separate, nearly fatal emergencies, each one arriving before the empire had fully recovered from the last.
The first of these came from the east. The Sassanid Persian Empire, Byzantium's oldest and most consistent rival, had been fighting an on-and-off war along the Byzantine-Persian frontier for centuries, but in the early 6th century, under the Persian king Khosrow II, the war changed character entirely. Taking advantage of a period of Byzantine political instability, the Emperor Maurus had been overthrown and brutally executed in 602 by a mutinous army officer named Phocas, whose own incompetent rule further destabilized the empire. Persian forces pushed deep into Byzantine territory in a way they never had before. They took Antioch in 611, Jerusalem in 614, seizing what Christians across the empire regarded as the true cross, the relic believed to be the actual cross of the crucifixion, and carrying it back to the Persian capital as a trophy. In 619, they took Egypt, the single most important grain-producing province in the empire, and the source of the free bread distribution that had fed Constantinople's population. By the early 620s, Persian forces had reached the Bosphorus itself, camped on the Asian shore directly across the water from the capital. The emperor who inherited this catastrophe, Heraclius, had come to power in 610 by overthrowing Phocas, and for the first decade of his reign, he appeared to be presiding over the empire's terminal collapse. He reportedly considered, at one especially low point, abandoning Constantinople altogether and relocating the imperial seat to Carthage in North Africa, a plan the Constantinopolitan patriarch and populace resisted fiercely enough that Heraclius ultimately shelved it. Then, beginning in 622, he did something almost nobody expected. Rather than continuing to defend an indefensible frontier, he took the field personally, the first Byzantine emperor in centuries to command an army in person on extended campaign, rather than delegating that role entirely to subordinate generals, reorganized what remained of the Byzantine army, financed partly through an extraordinary loan of church treasure that the Constantinopolitan patriarch agreed to melt down for the war effort, and led a series of campaigns directly into the Persian heartland, striking at Sassanid territory in the Caucasus and eventually Mesopotamia itself. The campaign succeeded on a scale that surprised contemporaries on both sides. By 628, Persian resistance had collapsed into internal political crisis. Khosrow II was overthrown and executed by his own son, and the new Persian government sued for peace on terms that restored everything Persia had taken, including the true cross, which Heraclius personally carried back into Jerusalem in a ceremony in 630. It should have been the greatest Byzantine triumph in centuries. Both empires had, in fact, fought each other to such complete mutual exhaustion that neither had any capacity left to resist what happened next. In 634, 4 years after Heraclius restored the cross to Jerusalem, Arab armies, unified under the new religious and political authority of Islam, began moving out of the Arabian Peninsula into Byzantine Syria. They defeated a Byzantine army at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636, a defeat so complete that it effectively ended organized Byzantine resistance in the Levant. Damascus fell. Jerusalem fell again, this time permanently in 637, the city Heraclius had personally restored the cross to just 7 years earlier, now passing out of Byzantine hands entirely. Egypt, already devastated by the Persian occupation and reconquest, fell to Arab forces by 642, cutting off the grain supply that had fed Constantinople for 3 centuries and forcing the end of the free bread distribution that had defined life in the capital since the reign of Constantine himself. Heraclius died in 641, having lived to see nearly everything he had spent his reign recovering taken away again by a force nobody in Constantinople had seen coming. The empire that emerged from this second catastrophe was smaller, poorer, and permanently on the defensive in a way it had not been since its founding. Byzantine Anatolia, the core heartland that remained, was reorganized into a new military administrative system called the theme system, dividing the territory into districts, each governed by a military commander or strategos, who controlled both civil administration and local defense, a pragmatic response to a world in which Arab raiding parties could strike deep into Byzantine territory in any given campaigning season, and the old provincial
official bureaucracy no longer had the resources to respond through conventional means. Anatolia's interior, meanwhile, was adapting to permanent frontier conditions in ways that left behind some of the most visually striking surviving evidence of this whole period. In the volcanic region of Cappadocia, communities carved entire churches, monasteries, and in some cases, full underground settlements directly into the region's distinctively soft, easily worked tufa rock. Structures that offered a practical advantage no conventional stone building could match on a contested frontier. They could be sealed, concealed, and defended against raiding parties with a fraction of the resources a walled town required, while still housing functioning communities, complete with painted chapels, whose frescoes, protected from weather by the surrounding rock rather than exposed on an external wall, have survived in some cases with their original color remarkably intact across more than 1,000 years. The rock-cut churches of Cappadocia were not, in other words, an isolated regional curiosity. They were a direct, practical adaptation to exactly the same conditions of chronic insecurity that produced the theme system and the expansion of monasticism elsewhere in the empire during these same difficult centuries. Arab naval power grew quickly enough that Constantinople itself came under direct siege twice within the following century, first in 674 to 678 and again in 717 to 718. Both sieges were broken in significant part by a Byzantine military technology that has become one of the empire's most famous and most genuinely mysterious inventions: Greek fire, an incendiary liquid weapon projected from bronze siphons mounted on the bows of Byzantine dromon warships, capable of burning even on the surface of water. The exact chemical composition of Greek fire was a closely guarded state secret, restricted to a small hereditary circle of specialists, and it was guarded so effectively that the precise formula has never been definitively recovered by modern historians. What survives is the testimony of both Byzantine and Arab sources describing its effect: entire enemy fleets set alight on the water, unable to extinguish flames that continued to burn even when doused. Whatever the exact chemistry, the psychological and tactical effect was real enough to help break two sieges that could each individually have ended the empire in the 7th and 8th centuries. Even as it fought for its physical survival on two fronts, the empire spent much of this same period fighting itself over a question that seems, from the outside, almost abstractly theological, and that, in practice, tore through Byzantine political and cultural life for more than a century: the iconoclast controversy. Beginning in 726 under the Emperor Leo III and continuing intermittently under his successors until 843, a series of Byzantine emperors concluded that the empire's traditional veneration of religious icons, painted images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints, central to Byzantine devotional practice, amounted to idolatry, and that recent military disasters at the hands of a resolutely aniconic Islamic world, whose own rapid 7th century conquests had struck many Byzantines as inexplicable except as some form of divine judgment, might be connected to this failure. The argument, as it developed among iconoclast theologians, was not simply a matter of taste or discipline. It turned on a genuinely difficult question of Christology, of how a divine and infinite Christ could be legitimately represented in a finite painted image without either falsely limiting his divine nature or falsely separating the image from the person it depicted. It was, in other words, a serious theological argument fought with genuine intellectual weapons on both sides, not merely a pretext for imperial power politics, even though it also unmistakably became exactly that. Imperial policy swung between destroying and defacing existing icons and at other points restoring them, depending on which emperor or, in two significant periods, which empress held power. Irene of Athens, ruling first as regent and then, after 797, as sole empress, the first woman to hold the Byzantine throne in her own right rather than as a regent for a male heir, presided over the first major restoration of icon veneration in 787. The controversy flared again under later emperors before being permanently resolved in 843 under the regency of another empress, Theodora, in an event still commemorated annually in the Orthodox Church as the Feast of Orthodoxy, marking the final restoration of icons and the definitive end of iconoclasm as imperial policy.
What the controversy cost the empire, beyond the political instability of near-constant religious realignment at the top of government, was a significant portion of its own artistic heritage. Entire cycles of mosaic and fresco decoration, some dating back to the earliest Christian centuries, were deliberately destroyed or plastered over during the more aggressive iconoclast periods, and much of what modern visitors see today in Byzantine churches, the gold mosaic programs that define popular imagination of Byzantine art, dates from after 843, from the Restoration period onward, precisely because so much of what came before it no longer survives. It is worth pausing on what the theme system actually meant for the people living inside it, because the phrase military administrative district flattens a genuinely unusual way of organizing a society under permanent pressure. Soldiers in the theme armies were typically settled on hereditary military estates rather than paid as a standing professional force in the old Roman style. A farmer soldier who worked his land most of the year and answered a mobilization order when Arab raiders crossed the Taurus Mountains, passing both the land and the military obligation attached to it down to his sons. It was a system built for exactly the kind of world 7th and 8th century Anatolia had become, one where the raiding season arrived with predictable regularity every summer, where entire regions had to assume they might need to evacuate livestock and grain into fortified hill towns on short notice, and where a purely professional army, paid from a treasury that had lost Egypt's tax revenue, was no longer something the state could reliably afford. Out of this same climate of chronic insecurity, Byzantine monasticism grew into one of the defining institutions of medieval Eastern Christian life. Monastic communities had existed in the Byzantine world since at least the 4th century, following patterns established by early desert ascetics in Egypt and Palestine. But the 7th and 8th centuries, precisely the period of the empire's greatest territorial and existential crisis, saw monastic life expand and formalize significantly further, offering something a frightened, contracting society needed: places of genuine continuity, learning, and spiritual stability at a moment when almost everything else felt provisional. It was in exactly this period that the community on the remote mountainous Athos Peninsula in northern Greece began attracting the hermits and small monastic groups that would, by the 10th century, formalize into the semi-autonomous monastic republic that still governs itself there today, under rules that trace back with remarkable continuity to a charter granted by the Emperor John Zimisces in 972. By the time iconoclasm finally ended in the middle of the 9th century, the Byzantine Empire had spent roughly 200 years in a state of near-continuous existential pressure, invaded by Persia, invaded again by Arab armies who took away half its remaining territory and its most productive province, besieged twice in its own capital, and torn by a religious dispute serious enough to periodically depose and enthrone emperors over it. It had also, through all of that, never actually fallen. Constantinople's walls had held. The theme system had stabilized what remained of Anatolia into a functioning, self-defending core. And in the century that followed, that core would prove itself capable of something the empire had not managed since Justinian: genuine, sustained expansion. In 867, a former stablemaster and imperial bodyguard named Basil, born to a peasant family in Byzantine Thrace or Macedonia, depending on which account is believed, murdered his way to the Byzantine throne, killing his co-emperor and one-time patron Michael III in a palace coup. It is not, on its face, a promising origin story for what would become the most successful ruling dynasty in Byzantine history, and the path Basil took to reach that bedroom in the first place reads less like a conventional court career than a fairly ruthless accumulation of one lucky break after another. Byzantine chroniclers, most of them writing under the patronage of Basil's own descendants, and therefore inclined to soften the messier details, describe an impoverished young man from the provinces arriving in Constantinople with essentially nothing, catching the attention first of a wealthy widow, and then, through a combination of remarkable physical strength and a favorable reputation for horse taming, working his way into Michael III's personal household. Basil made himself useful to an emperor known for erratic, often dissolute behavior, was raised first to chamberlain and then, in 866, to co-emperor, and used that position, barely a year later, to eliminate first Michael's powerful uncle and chief minister, and then, in September of 867, Michael himself, murdered in his own bedroom after a night of heavy drinking, while Basil's fellow conspirators disabled the door that should have locked behind the emperor's private guard. Whatever the precise moral accounting of that night, Basil I founded the Macedonian dynasty, and over the following century and a half, his descendants and the exceptional generals and administrators who served alongside them presided over the most sustained period of territorial expansion, economic growth, and cultural production the empire had experienced since Justinian, without the catastrophic overextension that had followed Justinian's own conquests.
The recovery had actually begun slightly earlier in the reign of Michael III, with a wave of renewed intellectual activity centered on scholars like Photius, an extraordinarily learned patriarch of Constantinople who compiled a vast compendium of classical Greek literature, much of it now lost in its original form and surviving only through his summaries, and who re-established serious philosophical and rhetorical education at the Imperial University in the capital. This intellectual revival, sometimes called the Macedonian Renaissance, even though its roots slightly predate the dynasty itself, ran alongside the political and military recovery rather than following it, and the two reinforced each other. A functioning state with money to spend produced scholars, manuscripts, and monumental art. A literate administrative class produced better governance and better organized armies. Militarily, the 9th and 10th centuries saw the Byzantine frontier shift, for the first time in living memory, from permanent defense to sustained offense. This was driven in large part by a sequence of soldier emperors who rose through the army rather than being born to the throne, men like Nicephorus II Phocas, who ruled from 963 to 969, and John I Zisimus, who followed him from 969 to 976, both of whom had spent their earlier careers as successful frontier generals before taking the throne itself, often through the same kind of violent palace politics that had brought Basil I to power a century earlier. Nicephorus II reconquered Crete in 961, ending more than a century of Arab piratical raids launched from the island that had plagued Byzantine shipping and coastal settlements across the Aegean. He went on to retake Cilicia and, in 969, the great city of Antioch, one of the most significant cities lost to the Arab conquests 3 centuries earlier, restoring it to Byzantine rule for the first time since the 7th century. John I Zisimus, who had Nicephorus II assassinated in his own bedroom to take the throne, reportedly with the direct involvement of Nicephorus's own wife, the Empress Theophano, whose alleged affair with Zisimus turned a straightforward military coup into one of the more lurid palace scandals Byzantine chroniclers had to work with, pushed Byzantine campaigns further still, driving deep into Syria and Mesopotamia in a series of rapid annual offensives through the mid-970s that took Byzantine forces to the outskirts of Damascus and, according to Tzimisk's own triumphant letter back to Constantinople, within striking distance of Jerusalem itself, though logistical constraints and the approach of winter prevented any serious attempt at actually taking the city. Tzimisk died in 976, reportedly of typhoid contracted on campaign, before any permanent reconquest of the Holy Land could be attempted, and the eastern gains of both his reign and Nicephorus's before him, Cilicia, Antioch, the substantially expanded buffer zone across northern Syria, would remain, for the following century, the furthest the medieval Byzantine state ever again projected direct military and administrative control into territory it had lost to the 7th century Arab conquests. What made these campaigns possible, beyond the individual talents of the soldier emperors leading them, was a period of unusual and, for Byzantium, uncharacteristic weakness among its two traditional major rivals simultaneously. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had fragmented by the 10th century into a patchwork of competing regional dynasties no longer capable of mounting the kind of unified frontier pressure the early Islamic conquests had brought to bear on the frontier, while Bulgaria, the empire's other perennial threat, was itself absorbing internal and external pressure that left it unable to fully exploit Byzantine attention being directed eastward, a strategic window that Nicephorus, John, and eventually Basil II all recognized and used in turn, each building directly on the military reorganization and momentum the last had established, rather than starting from nothing. The dynasty's most consequential figure in terms of raw territorial and institutional impact was Basil II, who came to the throne as a child in 976 and ruled, eventually as sole and absolute emperor, until 1025, the longest reign in Byzantine history. Basil II's early reign was defined by internal rebellion, as ambitious aristocratic generals repeatedly challenged his authority before he had fully consolidated power. And it was this experience, historians generally agree, that shaped him into the famously severe, militarily obsessive ruler of his middle and later reign. Having survived the internal threats, Basil turned his attention to the empire's most persistent external rival in the Balkans, the First Bulgarian Empire under its formidable ruler, Tsar Samuel. The Byzantine-Bulgarian Wars under Basil II stretched roughly 4 decades, an unusually long and grinding conflict even for Byzantine standards, and it earned Basil a posthumous epithet, Bulgaric Tonus, Bulgar Slayer, based substantially on a single notorious event. After a decisive Byzantine victory at the Battle of Claudion in 1014, Basil is reported by Byzantine sources to have ordered the blinding of some 14,000 to 15,000 captured Bulgarian soldiers, leaving one man in every 100 with a single remaining eye so that he could lead his blinded comrades home. Tsar Samuel, according to the same accounts, collapsed and died of a stroke on seeing the returning column. Modern historians treat the specific numbers with appropriate caution. Ancient and medieval casualty figures are notoriously unreliable, but the episode, whatever its precise scale, reflects both the brutality that Byzantine warfare was capable of at its most extreme and the genuine permanent effect it had. Within 4 years of Claudion, Bulgarian resistance had collapsed entirely, and Basil had annexed the entire First Bulgarian Empire directly into Byzantine territory, pushing the empire's Balkan frontier back to the Danube for the first time in nearly 4 centuries. Basil's fiscal caution extended into a deliberate, sustained campaign against exactly the social trend that would eventually help unravel his dynasty's achievements: the steady accumulation of small peasant landholdings, the tax base underpinning the theme system's soldier farmers, into the hands of a small number of increasingly powerful aristocratic families, the same families their private estates and regional influence had already produced multiple armed rebellions against Basil's own early rule. In 996, Basil issued a sweeping land law requiring the wealthy to return, without compensation, peasant lands acquired since a cutoff date decades earlier, and imposed a collective tax liability, the allelongion, that made wealthy landowners in a district responsible for covering the unpaid taxes of impoverished neighbors who had defaulted, a policy explicitly designed to slow the consolidation of small farms into great aristocratic estates. It worked more or less for as long as Basil personally enforced it. It required exactly the kind of relentless, centralizing royal will that had made Basil's own reign so effective and so unusual, and it is a policy his weaker successors would abandon within a decade of his death, at which point the same aristocratic land consolidation Basil had spent 2 decades fighting resumed unchecked, and would go on to shape the political fragmentation that produced Manzikert within another 50 years. By the time Basil II died in 1025, the Byzantine Empire controlled more territory than it had at any point since before the 7th century Arab conquests, stretching from southern Italy through the Balkans, across Anatolia and into northern Syria and Armenia. He left behind, according to Byzantine chroniclers, an extraordinarily full treasury, the product of decades of careful, almost miserly fiscal administration, rather than the extravagant building or ceremonial spending that had characterized some earlier reigns. This same period saw one of the most significant single cultural transfers in medieval European history, one whose consequences are still visible on a map of the world today: the Christianization of the Rus. In 988, Prince Vladimir of Kiev, ruler of a rapidly consolidating state centered on the Dnieper River trade route linking the Baltic to the Black Sea and Constantinople, made a decision that would determine the religious map of Eastern Europe for the next 1,000 years. The traditional account, preserved in the later Rus Primary Chronicle and treated by most historians as at least partly legendary embellishment of a genuine diplomatic process, describes Vladimir dispatching envoys to evaluate the major faiths available to him: Islam, practiced by the Volga Bulgars to his east; Judaism, practiced by the Khazar elite; Latin Christianity, represented by German missionaries; and Orthodox Christianity in Constantinople itself. The envoys reportedly rejected Islam on hearing that it forbade alcohol, reasoning in the Chronicles account that drinking is the joy of the Rus. What supposedly settled the matter was their visit to the Hagia Sophia, where they attended the liturgy and returned to Vladimir with a report that has survived almost 11 centuries as one of the most quoted lines in the whole chronicle tradition: that they no longer knew whether they were standing on earth or in heaven, for on earth there is no such splendor, and they could not describe it, only say that there God dwells among men. Whatever actually happened in the diplomatic reality behind that story, Vladimir adopted Byzantine Orthodox Christianity for himself and his people, cementing the alliance with a marriage to Basil II's own sister, Anna, an extraordinary diplomatic concession that Byzantine emperors almost never made to a foreign ruler. Byzantine clergy, architects, and craftsmen traveled north to Kiev in the following decades, and the cathedral built there in deliberate imitation of Constantinople's own great church, St. Sophia of Kiev, still stands today, its interior mosaics executed by artists trained in the same Constantinopolitan workshops that had decorated churches across the Byzantine world. The religious, alphabetic, and cultural inheritance that flowed north from this single decision shaped the subsequent development of Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian civilization in ways that remain directly visible in Orthodox Christianity's continued place across Eastern Europe more than 1,000 years later. None of this expansion happened in a vacuum of pure military or diplomatic success. The 10th and 11th centuries were also the period in which Constantinople reached its peak as the economic center of the medieval Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. A city's population, plausibly reaching several thousand at its height, dwarfing every other city in Christian Europe by a wide margin, was sustained by a trading network stretching from Scandinavia via the Rus river routes to the Islamic caliphates of the Middle East to Western Europe, whose own merchant states, particularly Venice, increasingly built their own commercial fortunes on privileged access to Byzantine markets. The Byzantine gold coin, the solidus, often called the Byzant in Western European sources, held its value and purity so consistently across centuries that it functioned as something close to an international reserve currency, trusted from Western Europe to the Indian Ocean trade routes at a level no other medieval currency achieved. The intellectual life of the period matched its material prosperity. The Imperial University in Constantinople, reorganized and expanded under Constantine IX Monomachos in the mid-11th century, produced scholars like Michael Psellos, a philosopher, historian, and court advisor, whose writings combined serious engagement with Platonic philosophy, itself a somewhat delicate undertaking in a fervently Christian society, still working out its relationship to pre-Christian Greek thought, with an unusually candid, personality-driven historical chronicle of the emperors he served under, giving modern historians one of the richest surviving windows into 11th century Byzantine court life and politics. Some of this era's most distinctive institutions had nothing to do with warfare or territorial expansion at all. Byzantine hospitals, the yexinons, attached typically to monasteries and funded through a combination of imperial and private endowment, provided organized medical care on a scale and with a degree of specialization that had no real equivalent anywhere else in the medieval world at the time. Staffed by physicians who trained through a structured apprenticeship system and who kept written case records, prescribed regulated diets for different categories of illness, and in at least some documented cases, treated psychiatric conditions with music and occupational therapy rather than simple confinement. The most famous of these institutions, the hospital attached to the Pantocrator monastery complex in Constantinople, founded in the 1130s under John II Komnenos and his wife Irene, operated with a surviving founding charter detailed enough that modern medical historians have been able to reconstruct its ward system, staffing rotations, and patient capacity with unusual precision. A 50-bed facility organized into specialized wards staffed around the clock in a city where nothing comparable would exist in Western Europe for centuries. Byzantine silk production functioned as a similarly tightly organized state enterprise. Since the 6th century, when Justinian's agents are said to have smuggled silkworm eggs out of China concealed inside hollow bamboo canes, breaking a centuries-old Chinese monopoly on sericulture, silk weaving had been organized in Constantinople as an imperially controlled industry, with the finest grades of purple-dyed silk colored using a dye extracted from Mediterranean murex sea snails in a process so labor-intensive that a single garment could require the harvesting of thousands of shellfish, reserved by law for the imperial family and select court officials alone. Byzantine silk, along with Byzantine gold coinage, functioned as one of the empire's most effective diplomatic tools. Bolts of imperial silk gifted to foreign rulers from the Rus principalities to Western European courts served as a continuous, tangible advertisement of Byzantine wealth and sophistication that reinforced the empire's diplomatic standing in a way that treaties alone rarely could. That same instinct for calculated theater ran through Byzantine diplomacy more broadly, and it is documented in unusual detail thanks to a surviving 10th century text, the Book of Ceremonies,
compiled under Emperor Constantine VII, which lays out in exhaustive procedural detail exactly how foreign ambassadors were to be received, seated, and impressed. Visiting envoys, the German bishop Luitprand of Cremona, sent by the Western Emperor Otto I in the 940s, left one of the most vivid surviving accounts describing mechanical golden lions that roared and mechanical birds that sang in the throne room, and a throne rigged to rise dramatically into the air on a hidden hydraulic mechanism partway through an audience, so that a visitor who had approached at floor level found the emperor moments later elevated far above him, robed differently than before. Whether or not every visiting ambassador was equally fooled by the mechanism, the underlying strategy is clear enough. An empire that could no longer always guarantee military dominance over its neighbors invested heavily in guaranteeing that its neighbors left Constantinople convinced they had witnessed something no other court on earth could match.
Psellos himself is worth lingering on a moment longer, because his career illustrates how genuinely fluid the boundary between scholarship and statecraft could be in Constantinople at its intellectual peak. Trained from youth in rhetoric, philosophy, and law at a level that allowed him entry into the imperial administration, he went on to serve as a close advisor to no fewer than 7 successive emperors and empresses across several decades of rapid, often violent political turnover, a survival record that says as much about his political adaptability as about his intellectual gifts. He taught philosophy at the reorganized Imperial University, where his particular enthusiasm for reviving serious study of Plato and Neoplatonic philosophy occasionally drew suspicion from more conservative churchmen, wary of pre-Christian Greek thought gaining too much independent authority within a Christian curriculum, a tension that would resurface considerably more explosively 4 centuries later in Platon's own philosophical circle at Mistras. Psellos's Chronographia, covering the reigns of the emperors he served, breaks from the more formal, distanced tone of earlier Byzantine historical writing to offer opinionated, often catty character portraits of the rulers he knew personally: an emperor's vanity, an empress's superstition, a general's arrogance, rendered with the specific, needling detail of someone who had actually watched these people up close rather than composing an official, sanitized dynastic record from a safe distance. It remains one of the liveliest surviving works of medieval historical writing from any tradition, Byzantine or otherwise. By the middle of the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire stood, by almost any available measure, as the wealthiest, most militarily secure, and most culturally sophisticated state in the Christian world. It had recovered from near collapse in the 7th and 8th centuries to become something close to what it had been under Justinian, but this time without the same degree of catastrophic overextension. It would not last. Within a single generation of Basil II's death, a combination of internal political fragmentation among a newly powerful landed aristocracy and a new and unfamiliar military threat arriving from Central Asia would produce one of the most consequential defeats in the empire's entire history, a single afternoon on a plain in eastern Anatolia that would permanently alter the empire's demographic and territorial foundation. The decades following Basil II's death in 1025 exposed a structural weakness that his own long centralizing reign had partly obscured rather than resolved. Basil had ruled without producing an heir of comparable ability, or for that matter any direct male heir at all. The throne passed after his death through a rapid and often chaotic sequence of his relatives and their husbands, several of them elderly, none of them possessing anything close to Basil's military reputation or administrative grip. At the same time, a class of large landowning aristocratic families in the Anatolian provinces, families like the Komnenoi, the Ducai, and the Phocades,
several of whom had already produced emperors or serious claimants to the throne earlier in the 10th century, had spent the preceding century accumulating estates, private retinues, and regional influence that increasingly rivaled the authority of the central government in Constantinople. Basil II's fiscal caution and military dominance kept this tension largely contained during his own reign. His weaker successors did not. The military consequence of this drift showed up with brutal clarity in 1071 on a plain near the fortress town of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia. A new power had been building in Central Asia and the Iranian plateau over the preceding decades, the Seljuk Turks, a Turkic dynasty that had converted to Sunni Islam and rapidly expanded westward, absorbing Baghdad and much of the former Abbasid Caliphate's authority under their own sultans, while continuing to press against Byzantine Anatolia through increasingly frequent raiding. The Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, himself a general who had seized the throne through marriage to the reigning Empress regent rather than hereditary succession, assembled a large army, drawn in significant part from unreliable mercenary contingents and troops whose loyalty to Romanos personally, rather than to the empire in the abstract, was thin, and marched to confront the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan directly. What happened at Manzikert on the 26th of August 1071 was less a straightforward battlefield defeat than a collapse produced by internal Byzantine political betrayal layered on top of tactical error. As the battle developed, a significant portion of the Byzantine reserve force, commanded by a political rival of Romanos named Andronikos Doukas, withdrew from the field rather than supporting the main Byzantine line, whether through miscommunication, cowardice, or, as many later Byzantine sources concluded, deliberate political sabotage aimed at ensuring Romanos's defeat and removal. The Byzantine center collapsed under Seljuk pressure, and Romanos himself was captured, brought before Alp Arslan, and treated, according to multiple surviving accounts, with notable courtesy and even a form of chivalric respect by his captor, who released him under a negotiated ransom and peace agreement rather than executing him. The peace terms Alp Arslan offered were, in the immediate context, relatively moderate. What actually devastated the empire was not the battle itself, but its political aftermath. Romanos returned to Constantinople to find his rivals, led by the same Doukas family whose forces had abandoned him on the field, had already moved to depose him in his absence. He was blinded, a common Byzantine method of permanently disqualifying a political rival from the throne without technically committing regicide, in a procedure carried out so incompetently that he died shortly afterward from the resulting infection. With the central government consumed by the ensuing succession crisis and civil war among competing Byzantine factions, nobody was left to organize meaningful resistance in Anatolia itself, and Turkish warbands, not even in most cases under Alp Arslan's direct central command, but operating semi-independently, poured into the Anatolian interior over the following decade largely unopposed, settling permanently across territory that had been the demographic and agricultural core of the Byzantine state for the preceding 4 centuries. By the middle of the 1080s, most of central and eastern Anatolia had passed out of effective Byzantine control, and a new Seljuk-founded state, the Sultanate of Rum, had established its own capital at Nicaea, a city that had hosted one of Christianity's most important early church councils and now sat barely 100 miles from Constantinople itself under Turkish rule. This was the crisis Alexius I Komnenos inherited when he took the Byzantine throne in 1081, having fought his way to power through the same pattern of aristocratic military politics that had produced so much of the preceding chaos. Alexius proved to be one of the more genuinely capable rulers the empire produced in this period, spending the first 15 years of his reign stabilizing the empire's remaining territory against threats from multiple directions simultaneously. Norman adventurers under Robert Guiscard invading from newly conquered southern Italy, Pecheneg nomads raiding across the Danube frontier, and the ongoing Turkish presence in Anatolia. By the mid-1090s, needing skilled Western military manpower to help push back against the Turkish advance, Alexius sent an appeal for mercenary assistance to Pope Urban II in Rome.
What came back was not the modest mercenary contingent Alexios had apparently expected. Urban II, addressing a church council in Clermont in France in November 1095, transformed the request into something considerably larger, a call for a mass armed pilgrimage of Western Christian knights to recapture Jerusalem itself from Islamic rule, an appeal that tapped into a combination of genuine religious devotion, aristocratic ambition, and social pressures within Western European feudal society that Urban's own preaching had, to a significant degree, underestimated the scale of. Over the following year, tens of thousands of Western European crusaders, organized into several separate armies under different noble leaders, alongside a chaotic and poorly disciplined popular contingent known to history as the People's Crusade, which was largely destroyed crossing Anatolia before the main armies even arrived, began converging on Constantinople. The arrival of the First Crusade at Byzantine gates in 1096 and 1097 produced a genuinely uneasy encounter between two Christian cultures that had, over the preceding centuries of limited direct contact, developed sharply different assumptions about warfare, piety, feudal obligation, and each other. Byzantine sources, most notably Alexios' own daughter, the historian Anna Komnen, describe the Crusader leadership with a mixture of wary respect for their military capability and open distaste for what Byzantine court culture regarded as their unrefined, unpredictable, and dangerously acquisitive behavior. Alexios, for his part, extracted oaths of fealty and promises to return any reconquered former Byzantine territory to imperial control from most of the Crusader leaders before allowing them to cross into Anatolia, an agreement that would prove difficult to enforce and that several Crusader leaders, once established with their own independent territorial gains in Syria, simply ignored. The First Crusade did succeed in its stated aim, capturing Jerusalem in 1099, in a siege followed by a massacre of the city's population that shocked even contemporary observers used to the violence of medieval warfare. It also produced a set of new Crusader states in the Levant, including, most significantly for Byzantine relations, the Principality of Antioch, whose Norman ruler Bohemond had explicitly promised to return the city to Alexios, and instead kept it for himself, a betrayal that poisoned Byzantine Crusader relations for the following century. Away from the imperial court, this same period sustained a level of provincial religious and artistic life that rarely makes it into political narratives built around emperors and battles. Byzantine icon painting by the 11th and 12th centuries had developed into a highly codified craft tradition, typically practiced within monastic workshops following pattern books that preserved standardized compositions and facial types passed down across generations of painters, a technique including the distinctive olive-toned underpainting built up in successive translucent layers toward the final application of highlights meant to suggest divine light emanating from within the figure rather than falling on it from an external source, a technique that gave Byzantine icons their instantly recognizable luminous quality, regardless of which particular workshop or century produced a given panel. Provincial towns across Byzantine Anatolia and the Balkans, meanwhile, continued to function much as they had for centuries. A walled settlement organized around a market square and a principal church, governed by a mix of local notables and an imperial tax official, its economy resting on surrounding agricultural land worked by a mixture of free peasant farmers and larger estate laborers,
its social rhythms marked by the church calendar's cycle of feasts and fasts, rather than by any of the dynastic politics unfolding in Constantinople, which for most provincial Byzantines remained a distant abstraction, encountered mainly by the tax collector, the occasional passing army, and the coinage in their own hands, still stamped whichever emperor happened to currently hold the throne, with the same claim to Roman continuity that had appeared on Byzantine coins for 700 years before them. The 12th century that followed, under Alexios and his successors John II and Manuel I Komnenos, was in many respects a genuine period of recovery and relative stability. The Komnenian dynasty rebuilt significant portions of the Byzantine military along more sustainable lines, recovered parts of western Anatolia from Turkish control, and Manuel I in particular pursued an ambitious and expensive foreign policy that sought, with mixed success, to reassert Byzantine influence over the Crusader states, the Kingdom of Hungary, and even briefly to project power into southern Italy. Manuel spent much of the 1950s and 1960s locked in a long, largely inconclusive struggle for influence over Hungary, at one point securing an agreement under which a Hungarian royal heir, Bela, was raised at the Byzantine court and betrothed to Manuel's own daughter as part of a plan to eventually unite the Hungarian and Byzantine crowns, an agreement that collapsed when Manuel's own son was born, removing the need for a foreign heir, and that Bela, once he did eventually inherit the Hungarian throne on his own account, remembered with considerably more resentment than gratitude. Manuel's ambitions in Italy proved similarly costly and similarly unsuccessful in the end. Byzantine gold and Byzantine forces briefly supported rebellions against Norman rule in southern Italy, and Manuel maintained an expensive, decades-long diplomatic courtship of the Western Holy Roman Emperor and the papacy, aimed at restoring some version of a unified Christian imperial order under joint or Byzantine-led authority, an aspiration that never came close to realization, and resources later more defensively minded historians of the empire would argue might have been better spent reinforcing the Anatolian frontier against the steadily encroaching Seljuk Turkish presence Manzikert had opened up a century earlier. Constantinople itself during this period remained the wealthiest and by most accounts the most sophisticated city in the entire Christian world, its markets filled with goods and merchants from across the known world, its court famous and in some Western visitors notorious for its elaborate ceremony, its silk industry, and a level of luxury that struck less wealthy Western European nobility as almost impossibly refined. Manuel's reign also had to absorb the strain of a second major crusading army passing through Byzantine territory, a generation after the first. The Second Crusade, launched in 1947 in response to the fall of the Crusader county of Edessa to a resurgent Muslim power in northern Syria, brought two large Western armies, one under the German King Conrad and the other under Louis VII of France, across Byzantine Anatolia within months of each other. And Manuel, who had inherited his grandfather Alexios's wary skepticism of crusading armies, without inheriting quite the same freedom to simply refuse them passage, found himself managing the same delicate balancing act Alexios had faced 50 years earlier, now complicated by decades of accumulated mutual suspicion on both sides. Conrad's army, marching without adequate Byzantine guides through the Anatolian interior, was effectively destroyed by Seljuk forces near Dorylaeum, the same region where the First Crusade had won one of its early victories half a century before. Louis's French forces fared only somewhat better, and both surviving remnants arrived in the Crusader states considerably diminished, inclined to blame Byzantine bad faith for logistical failures that had at least as much to do with unfamiliar terrain and Seljuk harassment as with any deliberate Byzantine sabotage. The accusation stuck regardless, hardening into a persistent Western European suspicion that Byzantium was at best an unreliable partner in the crusading project, and, at worst, secretly complicit with the Muslim powers it claimed to oppose, a suspicion that would do real, lasting damage to Byzantine standing in Western eyes, and that historians now recognize as one of the deeper, slower-building causes behind the far more catastrophic breakdown in Byzantine-Western relations that followed within the next two crusading generations.
But the relationship between Byzantium and the increasingly powerful Italian maritime republics, Venice above all, but also Genoa and Pisa, had by the later 12th century curdled into something considerably more dangerous than ordinary commercial rivalry. Venice, in particular, had been granted sweeping trading privileges within the empire in exchange for earlier naval assistance, privileges that Venetian merchants had exploited so thoroughly that they had come to dominate much of the empire's own maritime trade, generating deep resentment among the Byzantine population of Constantinople itself. In 1171, Manuel I ordered the mass arrest of Venetian merchants throughout the empire and confiscation of their property, a move that produced a permanent rupture in Byzantine-Venetian relations. In 1182, following Manuel's death and during a subsequent period of political instability, a mob in Constantinople massacred a large portion of the city's resident Latin, meaning Western European, mostly Italian, population, an atrocity that Western chroniclers remembered vividly and that would resurface with considerable force in Venetian political calculation just over 2 decades later. One figure from this Komnenian recovery deserves to be named directly rather than folded into the general narrative, because she is also the source for a large part of what we know about it. Anna Komnene, Alexios I's eldest daughter, had been raised expecting to inherit the throne herself before her younger brother John II was born, and the succession shifted decisively away from her, a disappointment that, according to some later Byzantine sources, she never fully accepted and that may have contributed to a failed conspiracy against John's rule later in her life, after which she was effectively retired from court politics into a monastery. It was there, in that enforced retirement, that she wrote the Alexiad, a 15-book history of her father's reign that stands as one of the most substantial historical works composed by any woman anywhere in the medieval world. Combining genuine scholarly ambition, she frames her project explicitly in relation to earlier classical Greek historiography, with an unusually intimate, occasionally unreliable, but consistently vivid first-hand vantage point on the Crusader encounters, court intrigues, and military campaigns of her father's reign. Without her account, much of what is known about the First Crusade's passage through Constantinople would be far thinner and would rest almost entirely on Western European sources, with their own very different set of assumptions and blind spots. The military recovery that made this whole Komnenian period possible rested on a similarly practical foundation. Alexios and his successors rebuilt the Byzantine army less as the old theme-based system of hereditary farmer soldiers, which had proven increasingly unreliable after Manzikert demographic losses in Anatolia, and more around a professional corps of foreign mercenary regiments, Norman knights, Turkish horse archers, and, most famously, the Varangian Guard, an elite imperial bodyguard unit recruited originally from Scandinavian Rus warriors and, from the later 11th century onward, increasingly from Anglo-Saxon exiles who had fled England after the Norman conquest of 1066 and found on the far side of Europe employment guarding a Roman emperor whose own throne room still echoed with Latin ceremonial vocabulary their Norman conquerors back home used as well. Anyone walking the quays along the Golden Horn in this period would have seen exactly how deep that resentment's roots ran. Venice, and later Genoa and Pisa, operated entire self-governing merchant quarters along the harbor front, complete with their own churches, warehouses, and resident populations, largely exempt from the customs duties Byzantine merchants themselves were required to pay on the same goods passing through the same harbor, an arrangement originally granted in gratitude for Venetian naval assistance against the Normans in the 11th century that had, by the 12th,
calcified into a standing structural advantage no Byzantine emperor found it easy to revoke without provoking a crisis with a naval power the empire increasingly depended on for its own maritime security. A Byzantine silk merchant working the same stretch of harbor could watch Italian competitors, paying a fraction of his tax burden, undercutting him for business with Rus traders bringing furs and amber down the Dnieper, or Arab merchants carrying goods up from Alexandria and the Red Sea routes, the full commercial reach of the medieval world converging on a single stretch of Constantinople waterfront, and an increasing share of the profit from that convergence flowing out of Byzantine hands, even as it happened in a Byzantine harbor. Byzantine women, meanwhile, occupied a social position considerably more complex than either the harem-adjacent stereotype sometimes projected on Byzantine court life or a simple story of blanket exclusion from public affairs would suggest. Roman legal tradition, carried forward through Justinian's code, granted Byzantine women rights over property and inheritance that were, by the standards of most contemporary medieval societies, unusually robust. A married woman retained legal control over her own dowry and any property she brought into a marriage, could inherit and bequeath property independently, and could, under certain conditions, initiate divorce proceedings herself, rather than being purely subject to a husband's initiative. In practice, elite women's most visible avenue to direct political influence ran through the imperial family itself, and Byzantine history offers a genuinely striking list of women who exercised power in their own right, rather than merely alongside a husband or son. Irene of Athens, ruling as sole empress in the 790s and having her own son blinded to secure her hold on the throne. Theodora, Justinian's wife, whose personal intervention arguably saved his throne during the Nika revolt, and who used her position to advocate for legal protections for women, including harsher penalties for forced prostitution. Zoe Porphyria Geneta, born into the purple in the 11th century and married in rapid succession to 3 different emperors across her own long reign as the Macedonian dynasty's last direct heir, outliving or outmaneuvering each husband in turn. And Anna Komnene, whose historical scholarship has already been discussed, but whose very existence as a serious, self-consciously literary historian working within the classical Greek historiography tradition indicates an educational access for at least some elite Byzantine women that had few real parallels anywhere else in medieval Christendom. By the close of the 12th century, then, the Byzantine Empire remained wealthy, culturally dominant, and, on paper, militarily formidable. It had also accumulated over the preceding 100 years a set of unresolved grievances with the Western Crusader states it had never fully trusted and the Italian merchant republics whose commercial dominance it deeply resented, alongside internal political instability that would, within just a few short years of the century's turn, produce the single most catastrophic and self-inflicted disaster in the empire's entire 11th century history, one that would come not from Seljuk Turks or Persian armies at all, but from a Christian fleet that was supposed to be sailing to liberate Jerusalem. In 1202, a new crusading army gathered at Venice, intending to sail for Egypt as the strategic first step in a fresh attempt to recover Jerusalem, which had been lost again to Saladin in 1187. The Crusaders had contracted with Venice for transport ships on a scale the Republic had built specifically for the purpose, and when the Crusader army proved unable to raise the full payment it owed the Venetians, the elderly and, by most accounts, extraordinarily shrewd Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo proposed an alternative arrangement. The Crusaders could work off their debt by assisting Venice in capturing the rebellious Christian port of Zara on the Adriatic coast, an act for which the crusading army was promptly excommunicated by Pope Innocent III, who had explicitly forbidden any attack on fellow Christians. From Zara, the expedition's course bent further still, this time toward Constantinople itself. A Byzantine political exile, a young prince named Alexios Angelos, whose father had been deposed and blinded by his own brother,
approached the Crusader leadership with an offer. If they would help him retake the Byzantine throne for his father, he would pay their outstanding debts to Venice, fund the continuation of the crusade to Egypt, and place the Byzantine Church under the authority of Rome, healing the schism that had formally divided Eastern and Western Christianity since 954. It was an offer that solved every immediate financial and religious problem the Crusades' leadership was facing. And in the summer of 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived outside Constantinople and, after a difficult siege, succeeded in restoring the blinded former emperor Isaac II and his son, now Alexios IV, to the throne. What followed was a slow-motion catastrophe. Alexios IV proved unable to raise anywhere near the sum of money he had promised the Crusaders, whose army remained encamped outside the city, increasingly hostile and unpaid for the following winter. Popular anger in Constantinople at the presence of the Crusader army and at Alexios IV's association with them produced a fresh palace coup in early 1204, in which Alexios IV was deposed and strangled, and a new, staunchly anti-Latin emperor took the throne. With their financial arrangement now entirely collapsed and any remaining pretext for restraint removed, the Crusader and Venetian leadership made a decision that no earlier crusading army, whatever its other sins, had gone as far as taking. They would simply conquer Constantinople outright and divide the Byzantine Empire among themselves. The city fell in April 1204, and the 3 days of sack that followed have few real parallels in medieval European history for the sheer scale and systematic thoroughness of the looting involved. Churches were stripped of their gold and silver liturgical vessels, relics were seized and shipped west in numbers so large that a significant proportion of relics held in Western European cathedrals today can be traced directly to the 1204 sack, and the bronze horses that had stood atop the hippodrome since antiquity were carried off to Venice, where they still stand today above the entrance of St. Mark's Basilica. The Byzantine historian Nikitas Koniakes, an eyewitness, wrote with visible anguish of a civilization that had, in his account, endured Persians and Arabs and Turks across 8 centuries, only to be more thoroughly plundered by fellow Christians than any of them. The Crusaders installed a Latin Catholic emperor and divided Byzantine territory into a patchwork of Western feudal states, an arrangement that never achieved anything close to stable control over the wider Byzantine world. Byzantine resistance regrouped instead around several successor states established by aristocratic families who had escaped the sack. Most significantly, the Empire of Nicaea, established just across the Bosphorus in Anatolia under Theodora Lascaris, which functioned for the following half-century as the effective government in exile of Byzantine civilization, preserving its administrative apparatus, its scholarly and artistic traditions, and its claim to legitimate imperial authority, while the Latin Empire around Constantinople itself gradually weakened. Nicaea was not, in fact, the only Byzantine successor state to emerge from the wreckage of 1204. Along the southern shore of the Black Sea, a branch of the Komnenos family, cousins to a fallen line of the same dynasty that had ruled the empire through much of the 12th century, established an independent state centered on the city of Trebizond, so geographically isolated behind its coastal mountain range from the main currents of Byzantine, Latin, and Seljuk politics, that it would go on to outlast the restored Empire of Constantinople itself by 8 years, falling to the Ottomans only in 1461. A third fragment, the Despotate of Epirus, controlled Byzantine Greece's western coast and, for a period in the 1220s, appeared genuinely capable of recapturing Constantinople itself, before a serious military defeat at Klokotnitsa in 1230 at the hands of a resurgent Bulgaria removed Epirus from serious contention and left Nicaea as the last credible claimant standing. What 1204 produced, in other words, was not a single displaced Byzantine government patiently waiting to go home, but a genuine three-way competition among rival Byzantine successor states, each claiming to be the legitimate continuation of the empire, fighting each other nearly as often as they fought the Latin occupiers of Constantinople, a fragmentation that makes Michael VIII's eventual, almost improvised recapture of the city in 1261 considerably more remarkable than it might otherwise appear, arriving as it did after more than half a century in which Byzantine political identity had survived without any single undisputed center at all. In 1261, a Nicaean general acting on behalf of the Emperor Michael VIII Palaeologus found the city's defenses unexpectedly undermanned and retook Constantinople in what amounted to a swift, almost anticlimactic operation after 57 years of Latin rule. Michael VIII entered the city and walked into the Hagia Sophia, which had spent nearly 6 decades as a Roman Catholic cathedral, to formally restore Byzantine and Orthodox authority over it. The empire he restored, though, was a fraction of what was lost in 1204, reduced substantially in territory, permanently weakened financially by the loss of trade revenue that Venetian and Genoese merchants had captured during the Latin interlude and never fully relinquished afterwards, and now surrounded by rival Christian and Islamic states, several of them, ironically, stronger than the restored empire itself. The 2 centuries that followed the 1261 restoration were a genuinely paradoxical period in Byzantine history, a time of remarkable, sometimes extraordinary artistic and cultural achievement, unfolding against a backdrop of continuous, essentially irreversible territorial and political decline. The finest surviving example of this late Byzantine artistic flowering, sometimes called the Paleologan Renaissance, is the Chora Church in Constantinople, renovated in the early 13th century under the patronage of a scholar-statesman named Theodore Mitokis, whose mosaic and fresco cycles display a new naturalism, emotional expressiveness, and spatial sophistication that some art historians have compared, not unreasonably, to developments taking place in early Italian Renaissance painting during roughly the same decades, developments that, in a further irony, Byzantine scholars fleeing westward would themselves help inspire.
Politically and militarily, the story of these 2 centuries was one of near continuous contraction. Byzantine civil wars in the 1320s and again in the 1340s proved catastrophically self-destructive in ways that went well beyond the immediate human cost of the fighting itself. The second and more damaging of these conflicts broke out in 1341, when John Cantacuzenos, a wealthy magnate and close confidant of the recently deceased Emperor Andronicus III, found himself frozen out of the regency government established for Andronicus's 9-year-old son, John V, by a rival faction at court led by the boy's mother and the Patriarch of Constantinople. Cantacuzenos had himself proclaimed co-emperor by his own troops rather than accept exclusion from a government he had spent years helping to run, and the resulting 6-year war tore through Byzantine Thrace and Macedonia with a ferocity that occasionally spilled into open social conflict. In Thessaloniki, a radical political faction known as the Zealots seized control of the city for several years in what some later historians have described, with the necessary caveats about applying modern political vocabulary to a 14th century movement, as something close to a populist uprising against the city's wealthy landowning elite who were disproportionately aligned with Cantacuzenos's faction in the wider civil war. Both sides, at various points in the fighting, recruited Turkish auxiliary forces to reinforce their own diminished armies. Cantacuzenos in particular relied heavily on an alliance with the rising Anatolian Turkish Emirate of the Ottomans, whose founder Osman had died only a few years earlier,
and whose son Orhan was rapidly expanding Ottoman territory along the Byzantine Anatolian frontier that Manzikert and its long aftermath had already stripped from effective Byzantine control. Cantacuzene eventually won the war and entered Constantinople as senior emperor in 1347, but the empire he took charge of had been ravaged by 6 years of internal fighting, ravaged again within months by the arrival of the Black Death, and had, in the course of securing his own victory, handed an ambitious and rapidly growing Turkish power its first sustained, invited presence on Byzantine soil, a decision that provided the Ottomans with their first direct foothold in Europe. In 1354, an earthquake damaged the fortifications of Gallipoli on the European side of the Dardanelles, while it happened to be occupied by Ottoman forces who had been fighting as Cantacuzene's allies. Rather than withdrawing, the Ottomans simply kept the position, establishing a permanent European base from which their expansion into the Balkans proceeded steadily over the following decades, largely unchecked by an empire that by this point controlled little more than Constantinople itself, a scattering of Aegean territories, and the remarkable but isolated cultural enclave of Mistras in the Peloponnese. The Black Death reached Constantinople in 1347, the same year Cantacuzene's Civil War finally ended, carried along the same Black Sea and Mediterranean trade routes that had once brought the 6th century Justinianic plague to the same city 8 centuries earlier. Very likely, modern genetic and historical research suggests a directly descended strain of the same underlying bacterium resurfacing after centuries of dormancy in Central Asian rodent populations before spreading west along the trade networks linking the Genoese Black Sea colony of Kaffa to the wider Mediterranean world. Byzantine and Genoese sources both describe mortality in Constantinople rivaling or exceeding the horror of the 6th century outbreak, striking a population and a treasury already drained by 6 years of civil war, arriving with catastrophic timing precisely as the empire most needed whatever manpower and revenue it could still muster to respond to the Ottoman foothold Cantacuzene's own alliance had just opened in Europe. That Ottoman foothold expanded with a speed that should, in retrospect, have alarmed every remaining Byzantine leader far more urgently than it apparently did at the time. Orhan's son, Murad I, pushed steadily into Byzantine and Bulgarian Thrace through the 1360s and 1370s, capturing Adrianople and making it his new capital under the Turkish name Edirne by around 1369. A city barely 140 miles from Constantinople itself, now serving as the administrative center of the power that would eventually end the empire. Murad's forces went on to crush a coalition of Serbian and Balkan Christian nobility at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a defeat so significant in South Slavic historical memory that it remains a defining national reference point in the Balkans more than 6 centuries later, and one that effectively ended organized Serbian resistance to Ottoman expansion in the region. Murad's successor, Bayezid I, moved with even greater aggression, defeating a large coalition of Western European crusaders drawn from France, Hungary, and several other Western kingdoms, mobilized specifically in response to the accelerating Ottoman threat at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, and by the early 1400s had Constantinople itself under a prolonged blockade tight enough that the city's continued survival appeared to contemporary observers on both sides to be a matter of when rather than whether it would fall. What actually saved Constantinople at that moment came from an entirely unexpected direction. In 1402, the Central Asian conqueror Timur, known in Western sources as Tamerlane, invaded Anatolia from the east and crushed Bayezid's army at the Battle of Ankara, capturing the Ottoman Sultan himself, who died in captivity within the following year. The Ottoman state that had seemed only months earlier on the verge of finally taking Constantinople collapsed instead into a decade-long succession war among Bayezid's surviving sons, buying the Byzantine Empire an entirely unearned reprieve of roughly 50 years. a reprieve the exhausted, territorially reduced empire used to survive, but never to meaningfully reverse the underlying imbalance of power that Timur's intervention had only temporarily interrupted rather than resolved. By the early 14th century, Byzantine emperors were, in practical terms, Ottoman tributaries, ruling a capital that had shrunk from a peak medieval population plausibly above 400,000 to perhaps 40 or 50,000, with large sections of the area enclosed by its ancient walls reduced to farmland, orchards, and abandoned ruins. Byzantine emperors traveled repeatedly to Western Europe in a manner no earlier generation of Roman emperors would ever have needed to consider, and the reception they received abroad captures better than almost any single fact exactly how far Byzantine standing in the wider world had fallen. John V Palaiologos traveled to Rome in 1369 and personally converted to Roman Catholicism in a bid to secure Western military support, a conversion that carried no weight whatsoever for his own Orthodox subjects back in Constantinople, and that produced in practical military terms essentially nothing. He was later detained in Venice for unpaid debts on the journey home, an emperor of the Romans held for a time by a mercantile republic whose own founding myths still claimed connection to the very Roman inheritance he represented. Manuel II Palaiologos undertook an even more extensive tour beginning in 1399, traveling through Italy, France, and England, received with considerable ceremonial honor. King Henry IV of England hosted him at length over the Christmas season of 1400, and the visit produced enough of an impression on English chroniclers that it survives in several independent accounts. But honor of this kind translated into almost no concrete military commitment, since every court Manuel visited had its own more immediate wars, dynastic disputes, and financial pressures to manage first. By the time John VIII Palaiologos led the Byzantine delegation to the Council of Florence in 1439, formally agreeing, along with the Orthodox delegation, to submit to Roman papal authority and end the 4-century-old schism between the two churches in exchange for a promised Western crusade against the Ottomans, the agreement provoked bitter, widespread resistance back in Constantinople itself, where many among the clergy and populace regarded submission to Rome as a betrayal not worth making even to save the empire, encapsulated in a phrase attributed, whether accurately or not, to the Byzantine nobleman Lucas Notaras that he would rather see the Turcan turban ruling in the city than the Latin mitre. The promised crusade did eventually materialize in diminished form and was destroyed by Ottoman forces at the Battle of Varna in 1444, closing off the last realistic external chance of relief before the final siege.
Nowhere does the strange combination of political collapse and cultural intensity that defined these final 2 centuries come through more clearly than at Maestris, the hillside city in the Peloponnese that had grown up around a Frankish castle the Byzantines recaptured in the 13th century, and that functioned by the early 15th century as the empire's second great cultural center after Constantinople itself, governed by junior members of the imperial family bearing the title of despot. It was here, in the 1400s and 1410s, that an elderly philosopher named Georgios Gemistos, who took the additional name Plethon in conscious echo of Plato, taught a circle of students a genuinely radical synthesis of classical Platonic philosophy and Christian theology. Radical enough that some of his surviving writings argued more or less openly for a return to a reformed version of ancient Hellenic religious and philosophical thought, a position serious enough that after his death in 1452, the Orthodox Church had at least one of his major manuscripts formally burned as heretical. Plethon traveled to Italy in 1439 as part of the Byzantine delegation to the Council of Florence, and his lectures on Plato while there are credited by several Renaissance historians with directly inspiring Cosimo de' Medici's decision to found the Platonic Academy in Florence.
meaning that one of the intellectual seeds of the Italian Renaissance's revival of Platonic philosophy was planted, quite literally, by an elderly Byzantine scholar from a hillside town in the Peloponnese, 14 years before the empire that produced him ceased to exist. The final Ottoman siege began in April 1453 under Sultan Mehmed II, who had come to the throne at 19, determined to succeed where multiple earlier Ottoman sieges of the city had failed. He brought an army numbering somewhere between 60 and 80,000 men against a Byzantine defense that, including several thousand Genoese and Venetian volunteers under the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, numbered fewer than 10,000, a ratio that alone made the outcome, in retrospect, close to inevitable. What made 1453 different from every previous siege the city's ancient Theodosian walls had withstood was above all artillery. An urban engineer named Orban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines and been turned away for lack of funds, cast an enormous bronze cannon for Mehmed, capable of firing stone balls large enough to gradually reduce sections of the ancient walls that had defended the city for 1,000 years. The siege lasted 53 days, and for most of them, the defenders' task was less about winning than simply not losing before nightfall. Constantine XI's entire mobile field force, Byzantine and foreign volunteers combined, numbered perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 men spread across roughly 12 miles of fortification, walls facing the Ottoman land army to the west, the sea walls along the Marmara to the south, and the Golden Horn shoreline to the north, defended for the first weeks primarily by the boom chain sealing the harbor mouth rather than by manpower the city did not have to spare. Every night, work crews moved along whichever stretch of the Theodosian walls had taken the heaviest bombardment that day, hauling rubble, timber, and packed earth into the breaches Orban's great cannon had opened, so that a wall reduced to broken stone by evening could still present a defensible obstacle by the following dawn, a cycle of destruction and improvised repair that repeated, with only brief pauses, for nearly 2 months. Byzantine ships and their Genoese allies successfully repelled an Ottoman naval assault attempting to force the chain directly, a rare defensive victory that briefly lifted morale inside the walls, until Mehmed answered it with an engineering solution nobody inside the city had anticipated. Greased wooden rollers laid overland across the ridge behind Galata, over which Ottoman crews hauled a portion of his fleet bodily out of the Bosphorus and down into the Golden Horn in a single night, bypassing the chain entirely and forcing the defenders to extend their already inadequate lines to cover a harbor shoreline they had believed was secure. On the night of May 28th, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor, attended a final combined Orthodox and Catholic liturgy in the Hagia Sophia, the last Christian service ever held in the building, before returning to the walls. In the early hours of May 29th, following a massed assault, Ottoman troops broke through a section of wall near the Kirka Porta gate. Giustiniani was severely wounded and evacuated, an event that badly damaged Byzantine defensive morale at the critical moment, and the city's defenses collapsed within hours. Constantine XI Palaiologos was reported by multiple sources to have removed his imperial regalia and thrown himself into the final fighting near the breach, rather than survive the city's fall. His body was never conclusively identified afterwards. Mehmed II entered the city that same day and rode to the Hagia Sophia, where, according to Ottoman and later Byzantine accounts, he dismounted, walked into the vast interior alone, and stood beneath the dome in silence before ordering the building converted into a mosque, a use it would serve for close to 5 centuries.
The Byzantine Empire, the last continuous institutional link to the Roman state founded by Augustus nearly 1,500 years earlier, ended that morning. Elsewhere, Byzantine religious and cultural identity survived through a different channel entirely: the Orthodox Christian world that Byzantine missionaries had helped establish across the Balkans and the Rus lands over the preceding 6 centuries. The Ottoman conquest ended Byzantine political sovereignty, but it did not end Orthodox Christianity as a living institution within the former empire's territory. The Ecumenical Patriarchate, the senior bishopric of Orthodox Christianity, continued operating in Constantinople under Ottoman rule, relocated to the Fenar district of the city, where it remains headquartered to this day. Moscow, meanwhile, had already begun, before 1453, to describe itself in some court and church rhetoric as a kind of successor-inheritor of Byzantine religious authority, a concept that would later crystallize into the phrase Third Rome, and that fed directly into the political and religious self-understanding of the Russian state for centuries afterward, up through the Tsarist adoption of a double-headed eagle emblem directly borrowed from Byzantine imperial iconography. The Hagia Sophia itself outlived the empire that built it by an almost absurd margin. Converted to a mosque in 1453, with minarets added in stages over the following century, it served as one of the primary imperial mosques of the Ottoman Empire for nearly 500 years, becoming in turn a direct architectural model for later Ottoman mosque design, including the Blue Mosque built directly across from it in the 17th century in deliberate visual dialogue with Justinian's dome. In 1934, under the secularizing reforms of the modern Turkish Republic, it was converted to a museum, and in 2020 it was reconverted to active use as a mosque once again, a building that is now served across roughly 15 centuries as the most important church in Eastern Christianity, then a major mosque, then a secular museum, then a mosque again. Each transformation a direct physical record of who held power over the city at that particular moment. All of it happening beneath the same dome Anthemius and Isidore raised in the 6th century, a dome that has needed periodic structural reinforcement across the centuries, but has never once come down. The Theodosian walls, which withstood every siege the city faced for 11 centuries before finally failing against gunpowder artillery in 1453, still stand today in long surviving stretches across the western edge of modern Istanbul. Battered, breached in places, incorporated in sections into the fabric of the surrounding modern city, but recognizably the same triple wall system that turned back Avars, Arabs, Bulgarians, and, on one occasion, an entire Fourth Crusade army, before finally yielding to a Hungarian engineer's cannon. Mistras itself, the hillside city where Plethon taught his students beneath the plane trees, was largely abandoned by its remaining population in the 19th century, when a newly independent Greek state resettled the town's inhabitants in a new planned town built on the plain below, rather than continuing to maintain the old hill site. What that abandonment left behind, somewhat accidentally, is one of the most complete surviving examples of a late Byzantine urban environment anywhere in the world. Not a single monument isolated from its surroundings, as the Hagia Sophia now stands surrounded by a modern city that has grown up and past it, but an entire townscape of palace ruins, fortification walls, and multiple intact painted churches climbing the same hillside in roughly the same relationship to one another that a 15th century resident would have recognized. Now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, drawing visitors up the same steep paths that once connected the despot's palace to the churches below it. The Chora Church has its own complicated afterlife, converted to a mosque under the Ottomans in the early 15th century, a transformation that, in this instance, arguably preserved rather than damaged its mosaics, since Islamic prohibitions on figural imagery in active mosque spaces
led the Ottoman authorities to cover rather than destroy the Byzantine mosaic and fresco cycles beneath plaster and wooden paneling, sealing them away largely intact until a 20th century restoration project uncovered and conserved them for a museum reopening. The building's status has shifted again in more recent years, converted back to active use as a mosque in 2020 in the same period as the Hagia Sophia's own reconversion. Its uncovered mosaics now managed through a combination of screening and restricted viewing hours that attempts to balance active religious use against ongoing public and scholarly access to one of the most significant surviving cycles of Byzantine art anywhere in the world. The word Byzantine itself, which the empire's own people never used to describe themselves, was coined only after the empire's fall by a 16th century German historian, Hieronymus Wolff, who needed a convenient scholarly label to distinguish the medieval Greek-speaking Christian empire from ancient pagan Rome, and who drew it from the city's original pre-Constantine name, Byzantium. The label stuck so thoroughly in Western historical writing over the following centuries that it eventually obscured the empire's own persistent, unbroken self-identification as Roman, an irony that says a great deal about how Western Europe, for a very long time, chose to remember this civilization as something adjacent to Rome, derivative of it, rather than as its direct, continuous, 1,000-year-longer continuation. That misremembering has its own history. Enlightenment-era historians, most famously Edward Gibbon in the 18th century, treated the entire post-Justinian span of Byzantine history as a single, essentially undifferentiated story of decline, corrupt, stagnant, theologically obsessed, militarily feeble, a framing that flattened 11 centuries containing the Macedonian Renaissance, the reconquests of Nicephorus Phocas and Basil II, the Chora Church mosaics, and one of the most sophisticated legal, administrative, and diplomatic traditions in the medieval world, into a single word: decline. Modern historians have spent the better part of the last century pushing back against that framing, and the picture that has replaced it is considerably more interesting than either the old caricature of endless decline or an equally simplistic story of unbroken glory. An empire that faced genuine, repeated, near-fatal crises across 11 centuries, and that responded to nearly all of them until the very last one by adapting, reorganizing, and continuing. There is also a simpler, less flattering explanation for the forgetting, one that has less to do with historiography and more to do with how attention itself tends to work. Endings are easier to remember than long middles. Rome's western half has a clean, dramatic collapse attached to it, a single nameable moment in 476 that fits neatly into a sentence, even though the reality on the ground was considerably messier and more gradual than that sentence suggests. The Byzantine Empire's actual story resists that kind of compression precisely because its defining feature was not a single fall, but a repeated, centuries-long refusal to fall. Surviving Persian invasion, surviving 2 Arab sieges of its own capital, surviving a religious civil war over icons that lasted longer than the entire history of some other medieval kingdoms, surviving Manzikert, surviving the sack of its own capital by fellow Christians in 1204, and continuing to produce serious philosophy, serious art, and a serious claim to Roman legitimacy right up until gunpowder artillery finally did what 1,000 years of Persian, Arab, Bulgarian, Norman, and Crusader efforts had not quite managed. A civilization defined by sustained endurance rather than a single dramatic arc does not compress well into the kind of narrative shorthand that popular memory tends to favor. And so, across the centuries since 1453, it has mostly not been compressed at all. It has simply been left out.
What is left physically in the world today traces almost exactly the arc this account has followed. The dome in Istanbul, still the first thing many visitors look for on the skyline. The walls, weathered but present, running along streets most residents pass without a second thought. Manuscripts in libraries across Europe that exist at all because a Byzantine scribe, centuries before printing, sat copying Greek text onto vellum by lamplight in a scriptorium in Constantinople, with no way of knowing whether anyone would ever read the copy he was making. An Orthodox liturgical tradition still practiced today in Greek, Russian, Serbian, Romanian, and dozens of other languages, carrying forward patterns of chant and ritual first formalized in Byzantine churches over 1,000 years ago. A legal tradition running through Justinian's code that shaped civil law across continental Europe long after the empire that produced it was gone. None of it announces itself as Byzantine particularly loudly. That has always, in a sense, been the empire's peculiar fate, to have lasted so long, changed so much internally across that span, and been misnamed so thoroughly after its end, that its genuine, enormous influence on the world that followed it rarely gets attributed back to its actual source. Rome, everyone remembers. The 1,000 years after Rome supposedly fell, when an empire that called itself Rome kept building, kept ruling, kept surviving one crisis after another from a city on the edge of 2 continents, that part somehow still has to be explained every time, to an audience encountering it for what often turns out to be the first time. Even the empire's conquerors carried more of it forward than the word conquest usually implies. Ottoman imperial architecture in the centuries following 1453 developed largely through direct engagement with the building Mehmed II had just inherited. The great 16th century Ottoman architect Sinan, designer of the Süleymaniye Mosque and dozens of other major Ottoman religious buildings, spent much of his career in explicit technical dialogue with the structural problem Anthemius and Isidore had solved 1,000 years earlier, refining and, in some engineering respects, improving on the dome on pendentives system the Hagia Sophia had pioneered. The distinctive silhouette of the classical Ottoman mosque, a great central dome flanked by half-domes, ringed by slender minarets, is, in a real architectural sense, a continuation of a conversation Byzantine builders started, carried forward by builders working in a different faith for a different empire, using a structural grammar their predecessors had invented. Some of the inheritance is so thoroughly absorbed into ordinary life across the former Byzantine world that it no longer reads as an inheritance at all. Modern Greek descends in direct continuous line from the Greek spoken in Byzantine Constantinople, itself a continuation of the Koine Greek of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, meaning a fairly literate speaker of Greek today can, with effort, make sense of a Byzantine chronicle written 1,000 years ago, in a way that would be considerably harder for an English speaker attempting a text written in Old English from the same period. Culinary habits carried the same kind of quiet persistence: grilled meats on skewers, yogurt-based sauces, phyllo pastry, strong coffee served in small cups, travel today under a confusing tangle of competing national labels across Greece, Turkey, the Balkans, and the Levant, but much of that shared food culture reflects a common inheritance from the same late Roman and Byzantine Mediterranean world that once governed all of those coastlines from a single capital, regardless of which modern nation-state now claims a given dish as uniquely its own. The Ecumenical Patriarchate, still headquartered in the Fener district of Istanbul in a compound that has occupied roughly the same site since the 17th century, continues to this day to hold the honorary title of first among equals across the worldwide Orthodox communion, a direct institutional survival, however diminished in political power, of the church leadership that once crowned Byzantine emperors in the Hagia Sophia itself, now operating as a small, legally constrained religious minority within a modern secular Turkish state,
presiding over a global communion of Orthodox Christians, many multiples larger than the tiny local congregations still resident around it. Archaeology has, in the last century, filled in a great deal of what written sources alone could never fully recover. Excavations beneath modern Istanbul have repeatedly turned up fragments of the Great Palace complex, its mosaic floors, its harbor installations along the Marmara shore, alongside sections of Justinian's 6th century cistern network that Procopius once catalogued as a matter of practical siege preparedness, and that visitors now descend into purely to stand inside it. Manuscript conservation work at Mount Athos, at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai, and in libraries from the Vatican to Oxford, continues even now to identify Byzantine texts that had been miscatalogued, overlooked, or assumed lost. Even the empire's money outlived it in a manner worth pausing on. The Byzantine gold solidus, first standardized under Constantine himself in the early 4th century, and maintained at a remarkably stable weight and purity for the better part of 7 centuries afterward, functioned for much of that span as the closest thing the medieval and Near Eastern trading world had to a universal reserve currency, accepted, weighed, and trusted from Western Europe to India, largely because generations of Byzantine emperors resisted the temptation, so common among other pre-modern states under fiscal pressure, to debase their own currency for short-term relief. That discipline finally broke down under the accumulated strain of the 11th and 12th centuries as post-Manzikert territorial losses and mounting military expenses forced successive emperors to reduce the coin's gold content until Alexius I's currency reforms in the 1090s formally replaced it with a new standard, the hyperpyron, itself eventually debased in turn as the empire's fortunes contracted further after 1204. Even so, the reputation the original solidus had built across 7 centuries of consistency proved durable enough that Byzant, the Western European name derived directly from Byzantium, remained a byword for reliable gold coinage in European commercial and legal documents for centuries after the coin it originally described had ceased to exist in its old form, a small linguistic fossil of the empire's economic credibility outlasting the specific object that had earned it. The dome is still there. The walls are still there. The empire, in the only sense that mattered to the people who built it, simply continued as long as it possibly could, and then, on one morning in May, it didn't.